At 76 years old, Stevie Nicks confesses he was the love of her life. She has spent 50 years turning broken relationships into some of the biggest songs rock music has ever produced. Fleetwood Mac fans know the names Lindsey Buckingham and Don Henley by heart. But when Stevie Nicks was asked, flat out, to name the single greatest love of her life, she didn't say either of them. She said a name most casual fans don't even connect to her at all. And once you hear the story behind it, you'll understand exactly why she still talks about him the way she does. Long before the shawls and the platform boots and the sold-out stadiums, Stevie Nicks was a teenager in the San Francisco Bay Area who fell for a boy she met at a party, a guitarist named Lindsey Buckingham. They went to the same high school without really knowing each other, and it wasn't until that party, when she asked to sing harmony with him, that everything changed. Years later, they crossed paths again at San Jose State, joined a band called Fritz, and when that band broke apart, they decided to bet everything on each other, as a couple and as musicians. Their 1973 duo record, Buckingham Nicks, barely sold, but it caught the attention of a British blues rock band called Fleetwood Mac, who were looking for a new guitarist and ended up with a singer too. Those lean years before the fame mattered more than people realize. When the album flopped, Nicks worked as a waitress and cleaned houses to keep the two of them afloat while Buckingham kept refining their sound. She has described that period as one of the most defining stretches of her life, a time when she learned exactly what she was willing to give up for a dream that hadn't paid off yet. That kind of shared sacrifice creates a bond that fame alone can't replicate, and it may explain why, even decades later, she has never spoken about him with anything close to indifference. Then came Fleetwood Mac, and with it Rumors, an album now regarded as one of the greatest ever made, built entirely out of heartbreak. While the band recorded it, nearly every member was going through a breakup at the same time. Mick Fleetwood's marriage was ending. John and Christine McVie were splitting up. And Nicks and Buckingham were falling apart after years together, forced to sit in the same small studio and keep working side by side. There was no escaping the person who had just broken your heart, because that same person was also the guitarist you needed on the next track. That raw, unresolved tension is part of why the album still sounds so alive today. Nobody was performing a breakup. They were living one in real time with a tape rolling. That environment produced songs like Dreams, which Nicks reportedly wrote in about 10 minutes while sitting on a bed in a rented studio space, and Go Your Own Way, Buckingham's sharp, accusatory answer to her. Two people, one relationship falling apart, two very different songs about it, and both became defining hits of the decade. In later years, Buckingham admitted there were long stretches where he wasn't over her, and he suggested she may never have fully moved on either. Nicks herself has called him her first love, someone she will always love in some form, even while insisting they could never actually be together again. Buckingham wasn't the only man in her orbit during those years. In the early 70s, Los Angeles was full of ambitious young musicians building what people now call the Laurel Canyon sound, and one of the central figures in that scene was singer-songwriter J.D. Souther, closely linked to the Eagles. Nicks and Souther had a brief relationship, short but intense, unfolding inside a music industry that ran almost entirely on male ambition and male gatekeeping. For a young woman trying to be respected as a songwriter rather than dismissed as somebody's girlfriend, that scene could be brutal, and many who've studied her career believe this period helped shape the fierce independence that shows up again and again in her later lyrics. Then came a betrayal that could have ended Fleetwood Mac before it ever became legendary. During the recording of Rumors, while her relationship with Buckingham was collapsing and Mick Fleetwood's marriage was falling apart at the same time, Nicks and Fleetwood began a secret relationship. Think about the position that put everyone in. Fleetwood was still legally married. Nicks was still raw from her breakup with Buckingham. And every day, the two of them had to sit across from Buckingham in the studio and pretend the tension in the room was purely creative. It wasn't. That romance didn't last, but instead of destroying the band, Nicks and Fleetwood eventually settled into one of the most enduring working friendships in music, one that carried them through decades on stage together. By the late 70s, Nicks was one of the biggest voices in rock, and across town, Don Henley of the Eagles was arguably the genre's biggest male voice. Their relationship was intense and on again, off again, playing out in an industry watching both bands at the peak of their power. It also carried something Nicks wouldn't discuss publicly for decades. In interviews years later, she confirmed that during their relationship she became pregnant and chose to end the pregnancy, explaining that Fleetwood Mac was only a few years into its rise and that becoming a mother in the middle of that chaos would have derailed the band entirely. She has also said that if she had given birth to a daughter, she planned to name her Sarah, tying that private grief directly to one of Fleetwood Mac's most famous songs. She has never described the decision as easy, but she has also never expressed regret about it, calling it the right choice for the life she was living at the time. Her next major relationship reshaped her sound as much as her heart. In the early 80s, preparing to release her debut solo album, Belladonna, Nicks worked closely with producer Jimmy Iovine, who would later co-found Interscope Records. Their professional partnership became personal, and the closeness between them shaped tracks like Stop Draggin' My Heart Around, her duet with Tom Petty, and Edge of 17, which became her signature solo anthem. Belladonna went to #1 and established her as a star outside of Fleetwood Mac entirely. The romance eventually ended, but unlike some of her other breakups, this one didn't end in bitterness. The two stayed on good terms, and Nicks has continued to credit those sessions as among the most creatively important of her career. Then came the strangest and saddest chapter in her personal history. Nicks' best friend since her teenage years, Robin Snyder Anderson, was diagnosed with leukemia in the early 80s while pregnant. Doctors delivered her son prematurely, and Robin died just days later, according to Nicks' own account. Nicks was named the baby's godmother, and only months after Robin's death, in 1983, she married Robin's widower, Kim Anderson. By her own telling, it wasn't romantic love that drove the decision. It was grief, and a need to feel like she was protecting the child of the friend who had known her since she was a teenager, long before fame. She has since called the marriage a mistake, and it ended after about 8 months. But her bond with Robin's son endured. She kept photographs, home videos, and a book she wrote in the year Robin died, all set aside for the day he was old enough to want them, and the two eventually reconnected. And then, in 1983, at a hotel bar in Dallas, everything changed again. Nicks met Joe Walsh, the guitarist known for his work with the James Gang and later the Eagles, the very band that had already given her Don Henley. By her own description, the connection was almost instant. She has said she spotted him across the room, walked straight over without hesitation, and sat down beside him. She later called the two of them the perfect, complete, crazy pair. What set this relationship apart from the others was a sense of equality that hadn't quite existed with anyone else. This wasn't a producer shaping her sound, or a bandmate she had to face in the studio every single day, or a marriage built out of duty. It was, by her own account, a genuine creative and emotional partnership, one where both of them wrote music for each other and understood each other in a way few outside relationships had matched. She worked alongside him on his 1985 album, The Confessor, and their relationship lasted roughly 2 to 3 years, on and off. But it came with a devastating complication. Both Nicks and Walsh were deep into substance addiction at the time, and it consumed the relationship. Nicks has been candid about how serious it became, describing the two of them as busy superstars doing far too many drugs, a couple, in her words, on a path toward disaster. In the end, survival is what broke them apart. Walsh reportedly told a friend of hers that he feared one of them would die and the other wouldn't be able to save them, and in 1986 he ended things and put real distance between them. Nicks has said it took her years to get over it, and that there was no other man in the world for her during that stretch, a statement she has repeated even decades later. Here's the detail that changes the whole story. In interviews over the years, including a widely cited conversation in the 2000s, Nicks was asked directly to name the love of her life, and she didn't hesitate. She said Joe Walsh. She has drawn a clear distinction between the two men who shaped her most. Lindsey Buckingham, she has said, was probably the man who loved her the most in her entire life. But her own great love, in her words, was Walsh. She has echoed some version of that sentiment in multiple interviews, once telling a magazine there was nothing more important than Joe Walsh, Not her music, not her songs, not anything, and that they had to break up or she believed they would die. Nicks memorialized that relationship directly in her 1985 song Has Anyone Ever Written Anything for You, a track written for Walsh, one of the rare times she named her inspiration almost outright instead of hiding it behind metaphor the way she did with so many of her other songs. Despite the breakup, despite the addiction that nearly consumed them both, the bond never fully disappeared. Both eventually got sober separately and stayed in touch over the years, maintaining real affection for one another. When Walsh has been asked in later interviews about being called the great love of Nick's life, he's responded with humility, calling her a great songwriter, a great singer, and a great person, while acknowledging that their time together shaped both of their music. It's worth noting that his own feelings never quite matched the intensity of hers. When asked directly whether he had been in love with her, Walsh said it felt more like loving a sister, describing their bond as two people finding refuge in each other rather than a great romance. He went on to marry someone else and build a family, and Nicks has said she's genuinely happy for him, even while admitting no one else has ever quite filled the space he left. So which is the real answer? Lindsey Buckingham, the man she has said loved her more than anyone else ever has, or Joe Walsh, the man she has repeatedly named, when asked directly, as the great love of her own life? Based on her own words, that distinction belongs to her, and she has drawn it more than once. Buckingham may be the love she keeps circling back to on stage, night after night, the one she calls her first love. But Walsh is the one she has specifically and deliberately singled out, when asked point-blank, as the great, great love of her life. Step back and look at the whole picture, and something becomes hard to ignore. Stevie Nicks' entire catalog reads almost like a map of her heart. Dreams and Go Your Own Way trace the collapse of her relationship with Buckingham. Sarah carries the quiet grief tied to the pregnancy she chose not to continue. Stop Draggin' My Heart Around and Edge of 17 were built in studio rooms she shared with Jimmy Iovine. And even songs never explicitly tied to Joe Walsh still carry the emotional residue of a love so consuming that, for a time, she said nothing else mattered. That honesty is exactly why her music still resonates with people who weren't even alive during any of these relationships. She never hid behind metaphor for its own sake. She turned specific, personal heartbreak into something universal enough that anyone who has lost someone, chosen a career over a relationship, or loved someone they couldn't keep, can hear their own story somewhere inside hers. It's worth sitting with just how many different kinds of love one woman lived through: a teenage romance that grew into a professional empire, a brief relationship that hardened her resolve, a secret affair with her own bandmate, a pregnancy she chose not to carry, a producer whose fingerprints are all over her signature sound, a marriage born out of grief rather than love, and finally, a connection so consuming she has spent decades calling it, without hesitation, the greatest love of her life. Now in her 70s, Stevie Nicks has kept circling back to the same answer whenever she's asked directly. Out of every man who shaped her heart, her sound, or her hardest years, one name keeps rising to the top in her own words: Joe Walsh. Whether the real answer is actually the boy she met in high school, the one she said loved her more than anyone ever has, is a debate fans will probably keep having forever. But when Stevie Nicks herself has been asked the question outright, her answer has stayed remarkably consistent. If this look at the real story behind some of rock's most iconic songs kept you watching, subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of the artists who shaped the soundtrack of our lives.